Cleopatra a Queen by Jacob Abbott. Read for you by Rick Chavez. The war by which Caesar instated Cleopatra upon the throne was not one of very long duration. Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit of Pompey about the 1st of August. The war was ended and Cleopatra established in secure possession by the end of January. So that the conflict, violent as it was while it continued, was very brief. The peaceful and commercial pursuits of Alexandrians having been interrupted by it only for a few months. Nor did either the war itself or the derangements consequent upon it extend very far into the interior of the country. The city of Alexandria itself and the neighboring coasts were the chief scene of the contest until Mithridates arrived at Pelusium. He, it is true, marched across the delta, and the final battle was fought in the interior of the country. It was, however, after all, but a very small portion of the Egyptian territory that was directly affected by the war. The great mass of the people, occupying the rich and fertile tracts which bordered the various branches of the Nile, and the long and verdant valley which extended so far into the heart of the continent, knew nothing of the conflict but by vague and distant rumors. The pursuits of the agricultural population went on, all the time, as steadily and prosperously as ever, so that when the conflict was ended, and Cleopatra entered upon the quiet and peaceful possession of her power, she found that the resources of her empire were very little impaired. She availed herself accordingly of the revenues which poured in very abundantly upon her, to enter upon a career of the greatest luxury, magnificence, and splendor. The injuries which had been done to the palaces and other public edifices of Alexandria by the fire and by the military operations of the siege were repaired. The bridges which had been broken down were rebuilt. The canals which had been obstructed were opened again. The sea water was shut off from the palace cisterns. The rubbish of demolished houses was removed. The barricades were cleared from the streets, and the injuries which the palaces had suffered, either from the violence of military engines or the rough occupation of the Roman soldiery, were repaired. In a word, the city was speedily restored once more, so far as was possible, to its former order and beauty. The 500,000 manuscripts of the Alexandrian library which had been burned could not indeed be restored, but in all other respects, the city soon resumed in appearance all its former splendor. Even in respect to the library, Cleopatra made an effort to retrieve the loss. She repaired the ruined buildings, and afterward, in the course of her life, she brought together, it was said in a manner hereafter to be described, 100,000 or 200,000 rolls of manuscripts as the commencement of a new collection. The new library, however, never acquired the fame and distinction that had pertained to the old. The former sovereigns of Egypt, Cleopatra's ancestors, had generally, as has already been shown, devoted the immense revenues which they extorted from the agriculturalists of the valley of the Nile to purposes of ambition. Cleopatra seemed now disposed to expend them in luxury and pleasure. They, the Ptolemies, had employed their resources in erecting vast structures or founding magnificent institutions of Alexandria, to add to the glory of the city and to widen and extend their own fame. Cleopatra, on the other hand, as was perhaps naturally to be expected of a young, beautiful, and impulsive woman, suddenly raised to so conspicuous a position, and to the possession of such unbounded wealth and power, expended her royal revenues in plans of personal display, and in scenes of festivity, gaiety, and enjoyment. She adorned her palaces, built magnificent barges for pleasure excursions on the Nile, and expended enormous sums for dress, for equipages, and for sumptuous entertainments. In fact, so lavish were her expenditures for this and similar purposes during the early years of her reign that she is considered as having curried the extravagance of sensual luxury and personal display and splendor beyond the limits that had ever before or have ever since been attained. Whatever of simplicity of character and of gentleness and kindness of spirit she might have possessed in her earlier years, of course gradually disappeared under the influences of such a course of life as she now was leading. She was beautiful and fascinating still, but she began to grow selfish, heartless, and designing. Her little brother, who was but 11 years of age, it will be recollected when Caesar arranged the marriage between them, was an object of jealousy to her. He was now, of course, too young to take any actual share in the exercise of the royal power or to interfere at all in his sister's plans or pleasures. But then he was growing older. In a few years he would be 15, which was the period of life fixed upon by Caesar's arrangements and in fact by the laws and usages of the Egyptian kingdom, when he was to come into possession of power as king and as the husband of Cleopatra. Cleopatra was extremely unwilling that the change in her relations to him and to the government, which this period was to bring, should take place. Accordingly, just before the time arrived, she caused him to be poisoned. His death released her, as she had intended, from all restraints, and thereafter she continued to reign alone. During the remainder of her life, so far as the enjoyment of wealth and power, and of all other elements of external prosperity could go, Cleopatra's career was one of uninterrupted success. She had no conscientious scruples to interfere with the most full and unrestrained indulgence of every propensity of her heart, and the means of indulgence were before her in the most unlimited profusion. The only bar to her happiness was the impossibility of satisfying the impulses and passions of the human soul, when they once break over the bounds which the laws both of God and of nature ordain for restraining them. In the meantime, while Cleopatra was spending the early years of her reign in all this luxury and splendor, Caesar was pursuing his career as the conqueror of the world in the most successful manner. On the death of Pompey, he would naturally have succeeded at once to the enjoyment of the supreme power, but his delay in Egypt, and the extent to which it was known that he was entangled with Cleopatra, encouraged and strengthened his enemies in various parts of the world. In fact, a revolt which broke out in Asia Minor, and which it was absolutely necessary that he should proceed at once to quell, was the immediate cause of his leaving Egypt at last. Other plans for making head against Caesar's power were formed in Spain, in Africa, and in Italy. His military skills and energy, however, were so great, and the ascendancy which he exercised over the minds of men by his personal presence was so unbounded, and so astonishing moreover was the celerity with which he moved from continent to continent and from kingdom to kingdom, that in a very short period from the time of his leaving Egypt, he had conducted most brilliant and successful campaigns in all the 3 quarters of the world then known, had put down effectually all opposition to his power, and then had returned to Rome the acknowledged master of the world. Cleopatra, who had of course watched his career during all this time with great pride and pleasure, concluded at last to go to Rome and make a visit to him there. The people of Rome were, however, not prepared to receive her very cordially. It was an age in which vice of every kind was regarded with great indulgence, but the moral instincts of mankind were too strong to be wholly blinded to the true character of so conspicuous an example of wickedness as this. Arsinoe was at Rome too during this period of Caesar's life. He had brought her there. It will be recollected on his return from Egypt as a prisoner and as a trophy of his victory. His design was, in fact, to reserve her as a captive to grace his triumph. A triumph, according to the usages of the ancient Romans, was a grand celebration decreed by the Senate to great military commanders of the highest rank when they returned from distant campaigns in which they had made great conquests or gained extraordinary victories. Caesar concentrated all his triumphs into one. They were celebrated on his return to Rome for the last time, after having completed the conquest of the world. The processions of this triumph occupied 4 days. In fact, there were 4 triumphs, one on each day for the 4 days. The wars and conquests which these ovations were intended to celebrate were those of Gaul, of Egypt, of Asia, and of Africa, and the processions on the several days consisted of endless trains of prisoners, trophies, arms, banners, pictures, images, convoys of wagons loaded with plunder, captive princes and princesses, animals, wild and tame, and everything else which the conqueror had been able to bring home with him from his campaigns, to excite the curiosity or the admiration of the people of the city, and illustrate the magnitude of his exploits. Of course, the Roman generals, when engaged in distant foreign wars, were ambitious of bringing back as many distinguished captives and as much public plunder as they were able to obtain, in order to add to the variety and splendor of the triumphal procession by which their victories were to be honored on their return. It was with this view that Caesar brought Arsinoe from Egypt, and he had retained her as his captive at Rome until his conquests were completed and the time for his triumph arrived. She, of course, formed a part of the triumphal train on the Egyptian day. She walked immediately before the chariot in which Caesar rode. She was in chains like any other captive, though her chains, in honor of her lofty rank, were made of gold. The effect, however, upon the Roman population of seeing the unhappy princess, overwhelmed as she was with sorrow and chagrin, as she moved slowly along in the train, among the other emblems and trophies of violence and plunder, proved to be by no means favorable to Caesar. The populace were inclined to pity her and to sympathize with her in her sufferings. The sight of her distress recalled to their minds the dereliction from duty of which Caesar had been guilty of in his yielding to the enticements of Cleopatra and remaining so long in Egypt, to the neglect of his proper duties as a Roman minister of state. In a word, the tide of admiration for Caesar's military exploits, which had been setting so strongly in his favor, seemed inclined to turn, and the city was filled with murmurs against him even in the midst of his triumphs. Cleopatra, during her visit to Rome, lived openly with Caesar at his residence, and this excited very general displeasure. In fact, while the people pitied Arsinoe, Cleopatra, notwithstanding her beauty and her 1,000 personal accomplishments and charms, was an object of general displeasure, so far as public attention was turned toward her at all. The public mind was, however, much engrossed by the great political movements made by Caesar and the ends toward which he seemed to be aiming. Men accused him of designing to be made a king. Parties were formed for and against him, and though men did not dare openly to utter their sentiments, their passions became the more violent in proportion to the external force by which they were suppressed. Mark Antony was at Rome at this time. He warmly espoused Caesar's cause and encouraged his design of making himself king. He once, in fact, offered to place a royal diadem upon Caesar's head at some public celebration, but the marks of public disapprobation which the act elicited caused him to desist. At length, however, the time arrived when Caesar determined to cause himself to be proclaimed king. He took advantage of a certain remarkable conjuncture of public affairs, which cannot here be particularly described, but which seemed to him especially to favor his designs, and arrangements were made for having him invested with the regal power by the Senate. The murmurs and the discontent of the people at the indications that the time for the realization of their fears was drawing nigh became more and more audible, and at length a conspiracy was formed to put an end to the danger by destroying the ambitious aspirant's life. Two stirred and determined men, Brutus and Cassius, were the leaders of this conspiracy. They matured their plans, organized their band of associates, provided themselves secretly with arms, and when the Senate convened on the day in which the decisive vote was to have been passed, Caesar himself presiding, they came up boldly around him in his presidential chair and murdered him with their daggers. Antony, from whom the plans of the conspirators had been kept profoundly secret, stood by, looking on stupefied and confounded while the deed was done, but utterly unable to render his friend any protection. Cleopatra immediately fled from the city and returned to Egypt.